The north was a place of slow dawns and long shadows, where the sun skimmed the horizon as though too weary to rise. The seas were iron gray, restless, and cruelly cold, and the air itself seemed made of salt and frost. To live in that world was to be in constant negotiation with the elements, and for the seafarers of Scandinavia, warmth was not a comfort, it was survival. When we picture the Vikings, we often see them in motion, their ships cutting through waves, shields glinting, the wind at their backs. But what we forget is the silence that came between those bursts of energy, the long stretches when there was nothing but water, the steady creak of wood, and the bone-deep chill that could find its way through any layer of wool or fur. It is in those moments that warmth becomes something more than physical. It becomes psychological, symbolic, a reminder that even in the harshest worlds, people found ways to feel at home. A Viking ship was not just a vessel of war or trade. It was a floating community, a small wooden world adrift on the sea, and like any home, it carried within it the need for comfort. The problem was that fire, the simplest and oldest source of heat, was almost impossible to use safely at sea. Open flame and oiled wood did not mix, especially when the cold wind could turn a spark into a storm. Yet these sailors found other ways to fight the freeze. The first and simplest answer was clothing, but not as we know it. Wool was their miracle material. It was thick, breathable, and insulating even when damp. Archaeological finds in sites like Birka and Hidibi show finely woven wool tunics, sometimes layered with cloaks that had been greased or felted to resist moisture. These garments were not crude. They were sophisticated, made with an understanding of warmth that modern fabrics still imitate. Beneath the wool came linen smooth against the skin, and over it, animal hides, sometimes lined with fur from sheep, goat, or even bear. Yet clothing could only do so much when wind whipped across the open deck. So the Vikings learned to heat themselves from the inside out. They carried barrels of ale, beer brewed thick and hearty, often spiced with herbs or fruit, to give strength and flavor. They drank it not to grow drunk, but to feel life return to their limbs. Some sagas speak of warmed mead, honey wine that could be gently heated over stones, the steam filling the air with the scent of sweetness and home. That brings us to one of their cleverest tools, the heated stone. Before departure, stones would be placed in a fire on land until glowing red. Once ready, they were carefully moved with tongs or wrapped in wet cloth and placed aboard the ship inside wooden chests or clay pots. These radiant stones would slowly release heat for hours, turning the small space of a ship's hold into a warm pocket against the cold. The same technique was used in dwellings during winter. Hearthstones warmed the bed, and smaller rocks could be wrapped in fur to serve as primitive hand warmers. On the open sea, these stones were treasures, silent companions that glowed beneath the planks, unseen but essential. The ship itself helped preserve warmth. The Vikings designed their vessels with overlapping planks, known as clinker-built hulls, which gave both strength and flexibility. Between those planks, tar and wool caulking sealed out the sea. Animal fat was rubbed into ropes and oars to keep them from freezing, and thick animal skins were stretched across the ship's frame during storms to create temporary shelters. When anchored or beached, the crew would sometimes erect small tents of sailcloth, weighted with stones, and rest inside wrapped in fur blankets. Within that cramped space, body heat did most of the work. It is easy to underestimate the value of shared warmth, but in the medieval North, it was as vital as any fire. A dozen men sleeping shoulder to shoulder beneath thick hides could create a pocket of livable temperature even in the bitterest night. Some sagas hint at this quietly, not as a point of romance or hardship, but as a simple fact of seafaring life. Warmth was communal. No one stayed dry and comfortable while another froze. The Vikings also carried their sense of warmth in ritual. In the sagas and Eddic poems, heat is often described as a blessing, something sacred. The hearth at home was not only a place of fire, but of family, a spiritual center that symbolized the gods' favor. When they went to sea, the absence of that hearth was deeply felt. So they recreated it symbolically, through food, through shared drink, through the ritual act of toasting before a voyage. To raise a cup of mead was not just to celebrate, but to honor the warmth they could not carry, the fire of home, remembered through taste and sound. Even their gods reflected this reverence for heat. Thor's hammer was not only a weapon of thunder, but of the forge. It was the heat that shaped and protected. Freyr, a god of fertility and sunlight, was invoked during the dark months to bring life back to the land. In that sense, every warm moment at sea, every steaming breath or glowing stone, was a small act of faith, a reminder that warmth could be made, not just found. But even with all their skill, the cold was relentless. Frost crept into boots, ice formed on ropes, and the sea wind could slice through layers like knives. The sagas tell of men returning from voyages, with faces burned raw by cold, hands so stiff they could barely lift their cups, yet they endured. And in their endurance, they turned survival into something almost spiritual, a quiet defiance of the world's indifference. To imagine them there, the creak of the ship, the whisper of the waves, the faint glow of a heated stone in the dark, is to glimpse the fragile balance between human comfort and nature's indifference. The Vikings knew that balance intimately. They did not conquer the cold. They coexisted with it, made peace with it, found warmth in its shadow. It is a reminder, perhaps, that warmth is not always about heat. Sometimes it is about the sound of voices in the dark, the shared rhythm of breath beneath a sail, the memory of fire when there is none. For the Vikings, warmth was not a luxury. It was an art, a quiet, enduring act of creation in a world of frost. The sea was not merely cold. It was alive with coldness. It breathed frost, exhaled mist, and stole warmth as though it had a hunger of its own. The Vikings who crossed these waters, not once or twice, but through lifetimes and generations, learned that survival depended on the clever gathering of small comforts. They did not have stoves or sealed cabins, no thick glass windows to hold back the wind. Their warmth was crafted through resourcefulness, through the careful use of every tool, every scrap of material, and every bit of knowledge passed through story and habit. The first secret of warmth at sea lay in their relationship with the land before the journey even began. Before sailing, preparations were made with the precision of ritual. Firewood, for example, was dried and smoked days in advance, packed tightly in waterproof sacks made from tarred leather or oiled cloth. These bundles were not meant for constant burning, but for small controlled use, to heat stones, dry clothing, or cook when the ship was beached. The idea of an open fire aboard was unthinkable. One stray ember could ruin both ship and voyage. So the Vikings turned to a subtler art, storing heat. The hearthstones were chosen with care, dense, smooth river stones that could hold temperature for hours. At dawn, before departure, they were placed in a deep pit lined with ash and burning logs until they glowed faintly red. Once hot, they were lifted with iron tongs, wrapped in damp cloth or seaweed, and placed into small wooden boxes padded with wool. These boxes, sometimes called eldkista in later folklore, became portable hearths. On a calm night, one could open the box and feel a soft, steady warmth radiating out, enough to thaw hands, dry mittens, or gently warm a flask of drink. The heat stones were not merely tools, they were companions. They were handled with the same care as weapons or charms, because warmth, like luck, was something to be guarded. In sagas of long voyages, men are described as tending to their firestones as though to living things. A glowing stone beneath the planks might be the difference between waking and never waking again. Beyond stones, the Vikings built layers of insulation through simple but effective design. Beneath the deck planks, bundles of wool and straw were sometimes packed between beams to trap air. Animal hides, especially from reindeer or seals, were used as mats, their thick, oily fur naturally water-resistant. When the seas turned violent, oiled leather tarps were stretched along the windward side of the ship to create a barrier. These makeshift walls turned a portion of the deck into a low, tented space where crew could huddle together. Within that small enclosure, breath itself became a form of heating. Body heat, after all, was the most reliable source of warmth they had. On long voyages, the crew slept shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in shared furs. This was no gesture of camaraderie, but necessity. The warmth of one man's body preserved the next. A single layer of shared hides could trap enough heat to raise the air several degrees above the outside chill. The sagas rarely describe this directly. Modesty and understatement ruled the old storytellers, yet the evidence lies in archaeology. The distribution of bedding remnants and ship burials, the layout of crew spaces, even the pattern of wear on fur fragments, all suggest the same thing. Warmth was communal. There was also the matter of diet, an often overlooked weapon against the cold. The Vikings ate dense, fatty foods designed not for flavor alone, but for endurance. Dried fish, smoked pork, and butter-rich breads gave steady energy. They carried fermented dairy, often in the form of sour whey or curdled milk, which not only preserved nutrients, but aided digestion in the cold. On special voyages, they might carry dried fruit or honey, precious energy stores wrapped in sweetness. These foods provided internal heat, a slow-burning fire within. To eat was to stoke one's own hearth. Sometimes, when anchored near a coast, the crew could create small fires on shore, but even then, fire was a luxury. The smoke that marked warmth could also signal danger, giving away their presence to other ships or unfriendly villages. So they built hidden hearths, shallow pits filled with glowing stones and covered by a layer of sand. Above that sand, they placed cooking pots or kettles, allowing meals to simmer without visible flame. The scent of roasted fish or warm ale might drift quietly through the air, a fragile proof of life against the vast silence of the sea. Fur, too, played a central role in their heatcraft. The Viking world was rich in trade, and among the most prized commodities were pelts, the soft underfur of beaver, the thick hide of bear, the sleek waterproof skin of seal. These were not luxury goods alone, but survival gear. A fur cloak could mean life. Even the poorest sailors often owned at least one animal pelt, carefully mended and passed down from parent to child. The wealthy might wear layers reindeer beneath, wolf or fox above, each chosen for its balance of warmth and flexibility. The smell of fur, slightly musky, earthy, became, in a sense, the smell of safety. But warmth was not all about material. The Vikings carried with them charms and traditions meant to protect against the chill. Bronze pendants shaped like Thor's hammer were not only symbols of strength but of fire, the hammer that struck sparks from stone. Women at home wove runes into the hems of cloaks, invoking warmth and protection from sea spirits. Some believed that certain herbs, like juniper, angelica, or yarrow, held the power to keep one's body warm and one's spirit safe. These herbs were burned as incense, tucked into pouches, or brewed into drink before a voyage. Whether by science or belief, such rituals gave warmth a spiritual texture. It was something one could call upon, not just create. Even the act of rowing was part of the design. Physical movement generated heat, and so long as the oarsmen kept to their rhythm, the cold was bearable. The real challenge came at night, when stillness invited frost. Some crews took turns rowing in the dark hours, not to move the ship, but simply to stay warm. The steady pull of the oar, the sound of wood in water, became a lullaby, a rhythm of endurance. When storms came and the wind howled across the deck like a living beast, warmth took on a different meaning. The crew would draw together under their fur coverings, close their eyes, and wait. The sound of the storm became part of the body's rhythm. Inhale with the waves, exhale with the creak of the hull. The heat stones dimmed, the furs grew damp, and yet in that shared closeness there was a strange peace. They did not resist the cold completely. They met it halfway, letting it brush their faces and hands while guarding the heart's warmth. To live with the sea was to accept its terms. Some historians have suggested that Viking ships were more comfortable than one might expect, not because they had luxuries, but because they were built around human endurance. Every part of their design, from the curved hull to the flexible rigging, allowed movement and adaptation. The same principle applied to warmth. They could not carry fire, but they carried the idea of fire, stored in stone, fur, breath, and ritual. In that sense, their ships were not just tools of exploration, but vessels of human warmth, drifting through a frozen world. The men who sailed them did not conquer the elements. They negotiated with them, piece by piece, hour by hour. Warmth came in small forms: a shared blanket, a steaming cup, a faint glow underfoot, but those small things kept them alive. And perhaps more than anything, they reminded them that home was not always a place. Sometimes it was a feeling that could be built even in the middle of an icy sea. To understand how the Vikings endured the coldest seas on earth, one must understand their idea of comfort. For them, warmth was not simply a matter of temperature, but of belonging, a sense that one's body and spirit were protected within a circle of familiar things. When they left their homes behind, they carried that circle with them in thought, in ritual, and in the habits of their voyage. This was their hearth culture, and it stretched far beyond the glow of any flame. The Gjörfur was the heart of a Viking household. Archaeologists who dig through the remains of longhouses in Iceland, Denmark, and Norway often find a single long, narrow fire pit running down the center. It was more than a source of heat. Around it, every act of life unfolded. The family cooked there, told stories there, repaired weapons, spun wool, and slept within reach of its warmth. The smoke that drifted upward into the rafters carried not just the smell of burning wood, but the scent of safety, of meals shared, of continuity. In Old Norse, the same word that described a hearth could also mean home itself. When seafarers set out, they lost that center. The ocean offered no solid ground, no chimney to send up a signal of warmth, but the memory of that hearth remained in the mind and spirit. The crew created smaller imitations of it, clusters of warmth made from habit and trust, to eat together, to sing in rhythm while rowing, to speak the same prayers before sleep. All were echoes of the hearth at home. In these rituals, they built invisible fires. At night, when frost gathered along the rim of the ship and the stars burned like shards of ice, men huddled together beneath firs. They could hear the sea striking the hull in long, slow breaths, and above it, the creak of wood and rope. In those moments, conversation often faded into silence, but the silence was not empty. It was filled with shared endurance, an unspoken understanding that everyone aboard was part of one body, one pulse. The Vikings were not a people of comfort in the modern sense, yet they had a deep awareness of what it took to remain human in hardship. Warmth, to them, was a matter of community as much as of heat. There was also a philosophy to their endurance. The sagas often describe cold and hardship without complaint, almost with pride. The hero does not curse the frost. He walks through it. The sailor does not lament the freezing spray. He accepts it as part of the voyage. This was not stoicism for its own sake, but an act of balance. The North taught them that to fight nature was useless. To live within it, one must adapt, adjust, and find grace in the struggle. That acceptance itself was a source of internal warmth, a calmness that dulled fear and turned discomfort into rhythm. The Viking relationship with the elements was spiritual as much as practical. Fire, water, air, and earth were not abstract ideas, but living forces. The sea could kill or bless. The wind could carry them home or scatter them forever. Fire was sacred, the gift of the gods, yet it demanded respect. That is why, even on land, fires were treated almost ceremonially. To light one was to call upon divine favor. To let it die unattended was shameful. When sailors carried their heated stones or concealed embers from the last fire they had made ashore, they were in a sense carrying a piece of the divine. They were keeping the gods' warmth alive upon the waves. Psychologically, these acts of reverence mattered more than the heat itself. In a world without certainty, the act of tending to warmth, even symbolically, provided a sense of control. One could not change the sea or command the wind, but one could guard a glowing stone, share a warm drink, wrap a sleeping comrade in fur. These small gestures gave structure to a world that might otherwise have felt endless and indifferent. Some researchers of Viking culture have suggested that music and rhythm also played a role in this emotional warmth. Rowing chants, sung in deep, even voices, kept the body in motion and the mind focused. The songs themselves often carried imagery of home, hearth, and light, reminders of the warmth waiting beyond the horizon. The steady beat of oars on water mimicked the steady crackle of a hearth. It is not hard to imagine that in the dark hours of the voyage, The sound of human rhythm became a kind of inner fire. The concept of Inangard and Utangard, inside and outside the enclosure, was another piece of this mental landscape. Inside was order, warmth, community, the known. Outside was chaos, cold, danger, and the unknown. The Viking ship existed between these worlds. It was a fragile boundary, an enclosure afloat. To survive, the crew had to make it feel like the inside, to fill it with order and ritual, to make the cold bearable by making the space meaningful. This was their psychological insulation. The sea could be endless, but the ship was home, and the men within it were family. Even in death, warmth remained a symbol of continuity. In ship burials found across Scandinavia and the British Isles, traces of burnt offerings and ash appear near the bodies, remnants of fire laid beside the deceased. These were not accidental. Fire marked transition, guidance, and remembrance. It was the light that led souls to the next world, the same element that once kept sailors alive on icy waters became the beacon that carried them beyond. In a way, the Viking art of fireless comfort was less about technology and more about attitude. They learned to find warmth in motion, in rhythm, in shared silence. They made the absence of fire into a kind of discipline, a test that deepened their connection with one another and with the forces that ruled their world. Their survival depended as much on their mental resilience as on their furs and stones. Imagine, then, a night at sea in the 9th century. The sky is black glass. The moonlight slides across the water like metal. A ship drifts quietly between the swells, its sail lowered, its men asleep. Beneath the deck, a stone still glows faintly, radiating its slow, gentle warmth. The crew, wrapped in hides, breathe in unison. Their world is dark, cold, and infinite, and yet within that darkness there is peace. They are warm, not because of fire, but because of what they share. That is how the Vikings mastered the cold. Not by defeating it, but by learning its rhythm. Their ships were not merely machines of travel or conquest, but instruments of endurance, living spaces where warmth was crafted from ingenuity, ritual, and companionship. They sailed not only with courage, but with an understanding that comfort is not always the absence of hardship. Sometimes it is the quiet knowledge that one can survive it. There is a moment that belongs to every age, the instant when hunger turns to curiosity, when the smell of something cooking, something not quite necessary but deeply tempting, stops a passerby in their tracks. In our modern world, we might call it junk food, that easy comfort that promises pleasure without purpose. But centuries ago, long before street carts and fast food chains, people in medieval Europe already understood that same craving. They simply satisfied it in different ways, with honeyed fritters, roasted nuts, and little pockets of pastry that sizzled in hot oil beside crowded markets. Food in the Middle Ages was, for most, a matter of survival. The poor ate to fill their stomachs, not to delight their senses. Bread, porridge, ale, and vegetables formed the daily rhythm of diet. But even in the hardest times, people sought moments of sweetness and salt. Human beings have always been drawn to indulgence, especially when it feels slightly forbidden. And in medieval towns, those moments of indulgence appeared wherever people gathered at fairs, in tavern doorways, near churches, and along the bridges where merchants sold their wares. The earliest medieval snacks were born from practicality: leftover dough, scraps of cheese, small fish, and dried fruit. These became the foundations of the street cook's art. Markets were alive with sound and motion, vendors calling, horses clattering, church bells echoing through the air. Amid it all came the smells: hot oil, roasting meat, caramelized sugar. In Paris, London, and Bruges, small vendors set up wooden stalls where cauldrons bubbled over coals. They fried wafers, pancakes, and pastries in animal fat, selling them for a few copper coins to anyone passing by. To eat something fried and hot from the pan was a luxury, even if the ingredients were humble. The most common medieval junk food may well have been the fritter. Recipes for these simple treats appear in cookbooks as early as the 13th century. Bit of flour, milk, egg, and sometimes ale for lightness, mixed into a batter and dropped into hot oil or lard. Apples, herbs, or bits of fish could be added for flavor. The result was crisp golden and deeply satisfying. Fritters were sold at fairs, weddings, and festivals, and even monastic kitchens made them for feast days. Sweet versions might be dusted with honey or sugar when available, while savory ones were sprinkled with salt or spices. In cities, taverns became the first true fast food shops. They were noisy, smoky, and full of laughter and argument. Travelers could find ale, warm pies and quick bites, fried cheese, roasted onions, or bits of meat wrapped in dough. These foods were often greasy, sometimes questionably fresh, and always irresistible. To walk into a medieval tavern was to be surrounded by the hum of life, a minstrel plucking a tune, dice rolling across the table, and the thick smell of meat and beer that clung to the air. Yet even within monasteries, those quiet sanctuaries of prayer and discipline, small indulgences existed. Monks and nuns were often skilled gardeners and cooks. They grew herbs, milled flour, and made wine. And though gluttony was condemned as sin, sweet treats were sometimes permitted in moderation. Honey cakes, almond pastes, and spiced breads appeared during feast days. In many abbeys, honey was a symbol of divine sweetness, a gift from creation itself. A monk might whisper a prayer as he stirred honey into a pot of crushed nuts and breadcrumbs, creating something halfway between dessert and devotion. Outside the monastery walls, markets buzzed with the sound of trade. Traveling fairs were the true heart of medieval street food. These fairs drew merchants from across Europe, selling not only goods, but experiences. There were puppet shows, fortune tellers, and contests of strength, and always somewhere in the crowd, a cook stirring a pan of something tempting. The smell of frying fish mingled with the sweet scent of roasted chestnuts. Children followed the aroma of honeyed almonds. Laborers reached for cups of hot spiced wine. Food at these fairs was part of the performance, noisy, fleeting, full of color and heat. Medieval people did not think of these snacks as unhealthy or shameful. They were small luxuries in a world that demanded hard work and endurance. A fritter or a bit of fried cheese was not rebellion but celebration. It reminded the eater that life, however rough, still held flavor. And while most meals were eaten in silence or solemnity, street food was social. It was shared, eaten with the hands, enjoyed in the open air. In a society where much of life was structured by the church and hierarchy, the market stall offered a brief democracy of pleasure. The ingredients used in these medieval snacks tell their own story of travel and trade. Sugar, for example, was a rare and expensive import from the East. available only to the wealthy in early centuries. For ordinary people, honey was the main sweetener, but by the late Middle Ages, sugar began to flow into Europe through Mediterranean ports, carried by merchants from Venice and Genoa. With it came new ideas of sweetness, crystallized fruit, candied nuts, and syrup-drenched pastries. These foods blurred the line between necessity and luxury. They were eaten by nobles in great halls and by townsfolk in alleys, each adapting the recipe to what they could afford. Spices added another layer of fascination. Cinnamon, ginger, pepper, and cloves, all precious, all foreign, were used in even the simplest of snacks when possible. A single pinch could turn an ordinary fritter into something exotic. The love of spice in medieval Europe was not just about flavor, it was about imagination. To taste cinnamon in a world of turnips and barley was to taste a hint of the faraway, a sensory adventure that crossed oceans and deserts without leaving the street corner. The church, however, did not always approve. Many preachers warned against indulgence, equating gluttony with moral weakness, but even the sermons could not stop the frying pans. People might listen to warnings on Sunday, then spend Monday at the market, nibbling on honeyed dough. Hunger has never been wholly obedient to doctrine. If you had walked through a medieval town square at dusk, you would have seen the glow of torches, the flicker of lanterns on wet cobblestones. You would have smelled roasting meat, frying oil, and yeast in the air. Somewhere, a baker's boy would be carrying trays of small tarts to sell, each filled with fruit, nuts, or custard. A merchant might stop to buy one, breaking it in half to share with a friend. That small shared sweetness, eaten standing up under the open sky, was the ancestor of every snack that has ever comforted a tired traveler. By the time darkness fell, the markets would quiet, and only a few cooks remained, scraping the pans, saving what oil could be reused. But the smell of frying lingered, drifting through narrow alleys, promising warmth and pleasure. It was the scent of comfort in a hard world, the medieval version of what we now call junk food, simple, affordable, delicious, and utterly human. The sound of frying is one of the oldest songs of comfort. Even in a time before clocks and chimneys, before recipes were written in neat lines, people knew that sizzle, that bubbling conversation between hot fat and dough, as the sound of pleasure about to happen. In the Middle Ages, this sound filled kitchens from royal castles to street-side taverns, uniting rich and poor through the simple joy of something golden and warm. Fat, not fire, was the heart of medieval cooking. Fire could roast, but fat transformed. It turned dough into crisp bubbles, fish into flakes, and meat into something tender and fragrant. In a world where ovens were expensive and rare, frying was quick, portable, and efficient. And though it might seem rustic to modern eyes, medieval cooks understood its science intuitively. They tested oil with crumbs, learned the right heat by smell, and reused fat until it thickened into a substance almost sacred, the essence of every meal that came before. Most frying was done in lard, rendered from pig fat. It was cheap, plentiful, and forgiving. Goose fat was a finer choice, preferred by wealthier households, while olive oil was a southern luxury, imported from the Mediterranean at great cost. Lard gave food a rich, deep flavor that was unmistakable, and perhaps a bit guilty. In a time of fasting seasons and moral caution, to eat fried food was to step slightly outside the lines. but that was part of the charm. The medieval cook's art of frying went hand in hand with improvisation. There were no thermometers, no precise measurements. A handful of flour, an egg, a dash of ale or milk, and something sweet or savory that was enough. The results were endless. Fritters made from apples, herbs, or cheese, pastries filled with minced meat, even fried flowers in springtime, dipped in batter and crisped into edible blossoms. These foods were often eaten with fingers, still hot and shared quickly before they cooled. The smell of a frying pan could travel down a street. Like a rumor, market vendors became known for their specialties. A woman who fried apple rings in honey, a man who sold puffs of cheese batter near the bridge, a widow who made almond fritters on feast days. Each had a small loyal following, regulars who returned again and again, not just for the food, but for the comfort of familiarity. The medieval market was less anonymous than ours. The cook knew the faces of those she fed, and the act of frying became a kind of social warmth. Honey was the sweetness that held all of this together. Before sugar became common, honey was the gold of the kitchen. It flavored ale, glazed meats, and preserved fruit through the winter. In sweets and snacks, it served as syrup, binding and glossing the rough textures of fried dough. Warm honey dripped over fritters, ran down the sides of pastries, and soaked into bread. It was sticky and messy, a sensual food that clung to fingers and lips. Perhaps one reason preachers warned against it so often. To eat with one's hands, to lick sweetness from one's skin, was indulgence in its purest form. In the homes of the wealthy, cooks experimented with combinations that bordered on decadent. Almond milk, made by grinding almonds and soaking them in water, replaced dairy during fasting days. Spiced doughs were flavored with saffron, rose water, or orange peel. In England, a dish called crisples appeared in royal kitchens, thin batter fried in oil and dusted with sugar and cinnamon. In France, oreilles de cris, crispy ear-shaped fritters, delighted guests during celebrations. Each culture gave its own name and twist to the same craving: hot, sweet, fried indulgence. But sugar changed everything. By the 13th century, sugar had begun to arrive in Europe in greater quantities through Mediterranean trade. It was still expensive, often sold in small cones wrapped in paper, carved into pieces with special knives, yet it opened a new world of possibilities. The first wave of what might be called a medieval sugar craze swept through royal courts and merchant cities. Candied fruits, spiced syrups, and crystallized nuts became symbols of refinement. To offer sugared almonds at a feast was to show both wealth and taste, but it also revealed a shared human truth. The more accessible sweetness became, the more people wanted it. In street markets, sugar was mixed with honey to stretch its use. Cooks would boil the mixture until it thickened, then pour it over nuts or seeds laid out on parchment. The cooling syrup hardened into brittle, medieval caramel. Children and adults alike gathered when vendors poured the glossy liquid, waiting for it to set so they could crack off pieces. It was sticky, it was messy, and it was joy. Spices added to the excitement. Cinnamon, ginger, and cloves, all costly imports, were added in pinches to create luxury on a budget. A single spoon of spice could elevate the humblest dough. The fascination with spices went beyond taste. It was about imagination. They carried the flavor of faraway lands. Arabia, India, Cathay, places most people would never see. Eating spiced fritters or honeyed nuts was, in its way, an act of wonder, a brief journey through flavor to another world. There were moments of disapproval. Of course, church authorities frowned on excessive pleasure in food, warning that to eat for delight rather than need was a dangerous path. Fasting seasons were strict, and gluttony was ranked among the deadly sins. Yet, curiously, many monasteries became keepers of sweetness. Their cooks preserved fruit in syrup, brewed spiced wine, and baked honeyed biscuits for feast days. Even within the cloister, the craving for comfort could not be erased. In winter, when days were short and nights endless, a pan of hot oil became a kind of hearth. The scent of frying filled the air, cutting through the cold. People gathered around the pan as though it were a fire, watching batter turn to gold. There was laughter, gossip, a sense that life could still be generous. Perhaps that is why fried food has never truly disappeared. It answers a need that is older than hunger, the need for warmth, pleasure, and the company of others. Picture it now. A medieval street at dusk, the cobblestones damp, the air alive with smoke and sound. A cook stands by her cart, stirring a pot of hot fat. The glow of the fire flickers on her hands as she drops spoonfuls of dough into the oil. They hiss and rise, turning golden. She lifts them out, drizzles honey from a clay jar, and hands one to a waiting boy. He takes it carefully, blows on it, and bites. Steam curls into the air. For a moment, the world is nothing but sweetness and heat. That was medieval junk food, made not with machines, but with patience, imagination, and love, fried in lard, sweetened with honey, and served with the warmth of human company. It was comfort you could hold in your hand. And though centuries have passed, the sound of that frying pan still lingers in every corner of our kitchens, a reminder that even in the hardest times, people have always found ways to make life taste good. Pleasure was a problem in the Middle Ages, not the existence of it, but the control of it. Everyone agreed that joy, laughter, and comfort had their place within limits, in moderation, under watchful eyes. The trouble was that pleasure had a way of slipping through rules like warm honey between fingers, and nowhere was this more obvious than in the kitchens and markets of medieval Europe, where the smell of frying dough could undo the resolve of even the sternest soul. For kings and clergy alike, food was more than nourishment. It was morality made visible. What you ate, when you ate it, and how much you enjoyed it, all carried moral weight. To eat simply was virtuous. To eat richly was dangerous. But to eat something delicious, something purely for pleasure, was deeply suspicious. And yet the temptation was everywhere. Fasting laws were among the most powerful tools of control. The Christian calendar was filled with days and seasons when meat, dairy, and sometimes even eggs were forbidden. The goal was to remind people of humility, sacrifice, and spiritual discipline. But human creativity rarely stays silent. Out of these restrictions grew an entire culture of substitutions and loopholes. If one could not eat butter, there was almond milk. If meat was banned, fish, or even mock meat made from ground nuts appeared in its place. Monks and cooks became experts in bending the letter of the law without breaking it. The church's greatest fear was gluttony, not hunger, but the love of eating for its own sake. This sin was preached against with almost theatrical passion. Paintings and sermons depicted greedy eaters as beasts, faces buried in bowls, hands dripping with grease. Writers warned that those who lived for their appetites risked becoming slaves to them. And yet, even the monasteries could not resist the pull of the kitchen. Records show monks being reprimanded for eating more than their share, or for sneaking into kitchens after hours. The same institutions that condemned indulgence were often its most practiced participants. Kings and city councils joined in the moral battle, though for different reasons. They feared excess because it symbolized disorder. In their minds, too much eating, drinking, or celebration could lead to riot and rebellion. Medieval governments issued sumptuary laws, strict codes dictating what people could eat, wear, or display based on rank. A noble could eat certain meats or use imported spices, but a commoner could not. Bakers were fined for making luxury breads too soft or white for their class. Even puddings and pastries were policed, lest they blur the lines between rich and poor. But the street cared little for such rules. In markets and fairs, people mixed freely. Food blurred class divisions faster than law could mend them. A servant might taste the same honey fritter as a merchant, a peasant the same spiced almond that once graced a noble's feast. Food was democracy in its most ancient form. Everyone could share in flavor, if only for a moment. And so, royal proclamations came and went, but the markets continued to smell of lard and sweetness. Vendors simply changed the names of their wares to avoid notice. What had been sweet fritters one week might become holy bread. The next, some claimed their fried pastries were sold for charity or as food for pilgrims. The deception was thin, but it was tolerated. After all, even the watchmen patrolling the market bought a few on cold evenings. The church also found itself entangled in the contradictions of pleasure. On one hand, preachers condemned indulgent foods as temptations of the flesh. On the other, churches themselves relied on feasts and festivals to draw people together. Saints' days, weddings, baptisms, and harvest festivals all revolved around food, and more often than not, that food was rich, sweet, and shared in abundance. Even Lent ended with a celebration so joyful that people often began preparing days in advance, giving rise to Carnival, a festival of excess before the fast. One of the church's favorite targets was the street vendor. Cheap food sold fast and smelled enticing, the very definition of temptation. In cities like London and Paris, officials tried to restrict where such cooks could set up, citing concerns about cleanliness and morality. But the reality was simple. Fried food fed the working poor. It was cheap, hot, and portable, ideal for laborers who spent long days in the fields or on the docks. To ban it would have meant hunger, and hunger was a sin of its own. Royal households, meanwhile, turned indulgence into theater. Banquets became performances of power, where sugar sculptures and elaborate pies demonstrated the reach of wealth. In England, entire castles were once made of pastry dough, filled with birds or fruit, and served as centerpieces. At one feast, a mechanical peacock covered in gold leaf was carried to the table as music played. These displays were carefully documented in chronicles, not just as culinary triumphs, but as political acts, proof that a king could command both nature and taste. Yet beneath this splendor lay a quiet hypocrisy. The same rulers who banned commoners from wearing silk or eating fine bread often maintained secret kitchens full of sweet indulgences. Their private cooks worked in near secrecy, crafting candied fruits, gingerbread, and spiced wines. These delicacies were shared among nobles behind closed doors, away from the eyes of those who preached restraint. Pleasure was a privilege, and that privilege was carefully guarded. But no wall could keep desire contained forever. As trade expanded, sugar became cheaper. Spices, once rare, began to trickle into middle-class homes. The line between luxury and common comfort began to fade. By the 15th century, gingerbread stalls appeared at every fair, sold not only to nobles, but to children and travelers. Honey fritters were eaten at weddings and funerals alike. The joy of eating sweet fried food had become not a vice, but a shared language, one that kings and clerics could never fully silence. When we imagine the medieval world, we often picture austerity, dark halls, hard bread, quiet prayers. But behind those walls was a pulse of warmth and rebellion. Every frying pan, every dripping spoon of honey was an act of quiet defiance against the chill of moral order. It said, life can still be sweet, even here. And so pleasure survived, not in the halls of power, not in the sermons of monks, but in the small daily acts of ordinary people, in a mother's hand rolling dough, in the laughter of a child with honey on his chin, in the hiss of fat on an open fire. The rules of kings and the warnings of preachers faded, but the sound of comfort endured. Even now, when we bite into something hot and fried, we echo those centuries of small rebellion. It is a reminder that pleasure has always found a way, golden, sticky, and irresistibly human. The medieval night began not with darkness, but with sound. Bells tolled in monasteries, calling monks to prayer. In villages, dogs barked once or twice, then settled. The hum of markets faded, carts rolled home, and the air filled with the soft breathing of animals in their stalls. For most of Europe, this was the hour when the world folded inward, when the day's noise withdrew and the private life of rest began. Sleep in the Middle Ages was not a single act but a landscape, a pattern shaped by class, season, and custom. It was comfort carved from scarcity, luxury born of invention, and in its many forms, it told the quiet story of how people sought warmth, privacy, and peace in a world that seldom offered much of either. In the poorest cottages, sleep took place close to the ground. The bed was little more than a pile of straw or rushes spread over packed earth, perhaps covered with a blanket, if fortune allowed. The straw was not always fresh. In many homes, it was changed only a few times a year. To make it softer, people mixed in dried herbs, lavender, mint, thyme, and chamomile, not for beauty, but to mask odors and repel insects. These sleeping places were sometimes called litter beds, though there was tenderness in the way families arranged them, carefully turning the straw before lying down, the scent of herbs rising as they moved. The bed was not an individual possession. It was shared, almost always. Husbands, wives, children, even grandparents might lie together for warmth, wrapped beneath one coarse blanket. In some households, chickens or pigs slept in the same room, their body heat a small comfort against the chill. To modern ears, this may sound harsh, but in those small, smoky cottages, the warmth of breathing bodies was often the only defense against winter. The middle classes, artisans, merchants, and minor officials, had it better. Their homes had raised bed frames, often wooden platforms stuffed with straw, hay, or feathers if they could afford them. A bedstead was a mark of modest success, a sign that one could lift oneself a few inches above the dirt and the drafts. Over time, bedding grew layered, a coarse sack filled with straw at the bottom, a mattress stuffed with feathers or wool on top, and several blankets or coverlets to trap heat. In towns, beds became symbols of dignity. They were often the most valuable piece of furniture in a home, built sturdy enough to last generations. The headboards were carved, the posts draped with curtains or embroidered cloth. Curtains were not only for beauty, they kept out cold air, and perhaps more importantly, eyes. Privacy was rare, and the simple act of closing a curtain around one's bed created a sense of ownership over one's rest, a small world apart. For nobles and royalty, sleep was ceremony. Great beds stood high off the ground, surrounded by thick curtains, canopies, and embroidered hangings. The mattress was layered with down and covered in linen sheets that were washed far more often than most people's clothes. Servants warmed the bed with brass pans filled with coals before their lords lay down. Sometimes the sheets were scented with herbs or rosewater, and pillows were stitched from silk. Sleep for the wealthy was not just rest, it was display, an extension of status even in slumber. Yet, even among nobles, the idea of solitude was strange. A king or queen rarely slept alone. Servants dozed nearby on pallets, ready to rise at the smallest command. Guards stood at the doors. Priests murmured prayers in adjoining chambers, and the silence was never complete. The notion of a private bedroom, closed and personal, belonged to centuries still to come. In the Middle Ages, sleep was a social act. Travelers, soldiers, and pilgrims faced another world entirely. Inns were crowded and uncertain places. A guest might share a bed with strangers, sometimes 3 or 4 to a mattress. Thieves and pickpockets were common. Many travelers slept with their money belts tied to their legs. To be granted a bed alone was a luxury reserved for the wealthy or the lucky. The rest took comfort where they could near the fire, on straw or beneath the open sky. The rhythm of night itself differed from ours. People did not sleep straight through. Historians call it segmented sleep, 2 distinct periods divided by an hour or 2 of quiet wakefulness. After the first sleep, people might rise to pray, tend the fire, talk softly, or even visit neighbors. Then, after an hour, they returned to bed for their second sleep. This pattern suited a world governed by the light of candles and moon, where time felt slower and darkness was not to be conquered, but lived with. Dreams, too, carried meaning. Sleep was thought to open a door between worlds, between body and soul, between heaven and earth. Monks recorded their dreams as signs of divine communication. Farmers spoke of dreaming the weather, mothers of seeing their lost children in sleep. A good night's rest was not merely comfort, it was balance between the physical and the spiritual. To sleep well meant to be in harmony with God, with nature, and with oneself. In the cold months, beds became fortresses against the dark. People slept in long shirts, woolen caps, and thick socks. They wrapped hot stones in cloth to warm their feet, or placed dogs by the bedside for heat. Curtains were drawn tight. In some homes, the hearth still glowed faintly, a red eye watching through the night. The air smelled of smoke and straw and human breath, not unpleasant, but earthy, real, alive. Through it all, there was the quiet dignity of rest. For the peasant who had labored from dawn, the merchant who had bargained all day, the monk who had prayed through evening bells, sleep was the single luxury none could be denied. It was not soft or easy, but it was enough. The medieval night was full of discomforts: cold, noise, fleas, the weight of darkness itself, yet people found ways to make it bearable, even beautiful. They stuffed their mattresses with herbs, embroidered their sheets, whispered prayers, and dreamed beneath the sound of wind against the walls. Sleep was their act of faith in the morning to come. When you picture them now, the peasant turning his straw bed, the noble lying beneath a canopy of silk, the monk resting in his narrow cell, remember that they all closed their eyes to the same night sky, to the same stars. However different their beds, the dream was the same: a few hours of peace before the world began again. Long before sleep became a matter of comfort, it was a matter of protection. The night was not merely darkness, it was alive with unseen forces, both kind and cruel. Shadows could carry spirits, dreams could reveal truths or traps, and the air itself, heavy, still, or foul, could harm the soul as easily as the body. So when people of the Middle Ages prepared for rest, they did more than make their beds. They made small rituals of safety, blending scent, sound, and faith to guard their sleep from what lingered unseen. The bedchamber was a place of transformation after sunset. Curtains were drawn to keep out drafts and spirits alike. Windows, if there were any, were shut tight with wooden shutters or stuffed with rags. The air grew close, scented with wax, herbs, and the faint breath of the day's smoke. To this atmosphere, people added their own small protections: a sprig of something fragrant, a whispered prayer, a charm tied above the door. Herbs were the most trusted companions of the sleeping world. Lavender was believed to soothe the spirit and drive away nightmares. Rosemary cleansed the air and guarded against illness. Mint refreshed the senses. Chamomile brought calm. These plants were gathered from gardens, fields, and monastery plots, dried in bundles and stored carefully for nightly use. Some were sewn into little linen sachets placed beneath pillows. Others were scattered among the straw and mattresses, their scent released each time the bed was turned. In England, it was common to strew rushes and herbs across floors and sleeping areas. This not only softened the ground, but released perfume when stepped upon, masking the smell of animals and unwashed bodies. Herbs were also burned or boiled, their smoke thought to purify the air. In a world without understanding of germs, people feared bad airs, invisible mists of disease and corruption. Fragrance in their eyes was not luxury, it was medicine. The connection between scent and protection ran deep. Medieval medical theory, drawn from ancient sources like Galen and Aristotle, taught that air could influence health through the body's humors, the delicate balance of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. A foul odor was a warning of imbalance, a sign that decay or sickness lurked nearby. Sweet scents, by contrast, were thought to restore harmony, to make the air temperate, and so to sleep surrounded by herbs was to rest in balance, guarded by nature's quiet breath. But not all protection came from plants. Many people believed in charms and objects of power, tucked close during the night. Crosses, medals, or relics were placed beneath pillows. A small book of psalms, or even a folded scrap of parchment bearing sacred words, might rest beside the bed. In rural areas, people tied red threads around their wrists to ward off spirits, or hung iron keys and scissors near the doorway to repel evil. These were not acts of superstition alone, they were gestures of comfort, the same impulse that leads one to check a lock or light a candle before sleep. The monasteries developed their own discipline of nightly peace. In their cells, monks lay on simple pallets of straw or wool, yet they too sought purity of air and spirit. Before retiring, they sang the Compline, the final prayer of the day, a chant so gentle it seemed to still the air itself. The words of the psalm, "In peace I will lie down and sleep," echoed through stone halls, mingling with the faint scent of beeswax and incense. For monks, herbs had symbolic meaning: lavender for humility, rosemary for remembrance, and rose for divine love. Their sleep was an offering, a nightly surrender of the body to the care of God. In wealthier homes, scents became a mark of refinement. Ladies kept pomanders, small metal or ivory balls filled with aromatic mixtures of clove, ambergris, or musk, to carry by day and hang near the bed by night. Perfumed waters, distilled from rose or violet, were sprinkled on sheets. Nobles believed that pleasant air promoted not only health, but good dreams. Physicians recommended that bedrooms face east for fresh morning light, and that sleeping chambers be filled with greenery. A well-kept bedchamber was a sign of both virtue and civilization. Dreams themselves were objects of fascination. The boundary between natural sleep and divine revelation was thin. Some dreams were dismissed as foolish fancy, caused by heavy suppers or restless humors. Others were recorded with reverence, as messages from heaven or omens of future events. Books of dream interpretation, drawn from both Christian and classical sources, circulated widely. A dream of water might foretell sorrow, a dream of bread, prosperity, a dream of fire, passion, or danger. To dream was to walk a bridge between the visible and invisible worlds, and people stepped upon it with care. The fear of nightmares ran deep. They were called night hags or mare rides, believed to be attacks by malevolent spirits that pressed upon the chest, stealing breath and rest. To prevent them, people used charms, prayers written on wax, knives placed under pillows, or herbs like St. John's wort hung above the bed. In some regions, it was said that turning one's shoes upside down beside the bed confused wandering spirits, keeping them from finding their way to the sleeper. Such beliefs may seem strange, yet beneath them lies a truth both simple and eternal. Sleep is an act of trust. In surrendering consciousness, one also surrenders control. The Middle Ages filled that space of vulnerability with comfort, scent, prayer, ritual, transforming fear into familiarity. A few herbs beneath the pillow, a whispered line of scripture, the smell of wax and wood smoke. These were the threads that bound the sleeper to safety. Even the arrangement of the sleeping room reflected these beliefs. Beds faced away from doorways so that a person's soul, which might wander during dreams, would not drift out into the night. Mirrors were covered, lest they trap reflections or spirits. Fires were damped but never fully extinguished, their embers glowing like watchful eyes. The night was both enemy and friend, feared for its darkness, cherished for its peace. As candles burned low and the air thickened with scent, the mind softened into stillness. The last sounds were simple: the rustle of straw, the sigh of wind, the faint creak of wood. A dog shifted near the hearth. Somewhere outside, a cock crowed too early, And in that hush, surrounded by the comfort of herbs and faith, the medieval sleeper let go, trusting that morning would come again. For all its fears and fumblings, the world of the Middle Ages understood something we often forget. Sleep is not just rest for the body, but healing for the soul. Their charms and scents, their whispered prayers, were ways of saying the same thing, that peace, however fragile, must be tended like a flame. Sleep in the Middle Ages was rarely a straight line. Unlike the modern pattern of a single stretch through the night, medieval people often experienced what historians call segmented sleep, a natural rhythm that divided the night into two distinct periods, with a waking interval in between. This pattern shaped life, ritual, and even imagination, creating a nocturnal world rich in both practicality and mystery. The first sleep began soon after dusk, once the day's labor had ended and the hearth fire burned low. Families huddled beneath their blankets, the straw or feather mattress yielding beneath them. The hum of animals, the flicker of candlelight, and the scent of herbs filled the air. Children slept close to parents, sometimes with animals for warmth. Even in noble chambers, the glow of the fire softened the edges of stone walls, offering a sense of security before the mind surrendered to dreams. The first sleep was deep, but not complete. After a few hours, many rose for what was called the watch, or the first waking. This could be a brief period of prayer, a trip to the privy, a conversation, or even a household chore. Some people walked outside to relieve themselves. Others stoked the fire or checked on the animals. Monks used this time for silent meditation or chanting, a bridge between the physical and spiritual worlds. The mind was alert yet gentle, hovering between the known and the dream. Stories and folklore thrived in this liminal hour. The waking night was a time when boundaries between the real and the supernatural thinned. Dreams were discussed in hushed voices, omens interpreted, and tales of ghosts or spirits shared in candlelit corners. Travelers and peasants alike believed that the dead could wander, that witches might glide silently past windows, and that animals sometimes carried messages from the unseen world. The second sleep, which followed this quiet interlude, was accompanied by a heightened awareness of both danger and wonder. The interval between sleeps was also a time of reflection. People might recount the day, plan for tomorrow, or seek insight from dreams that had already appeared. Monastic writers suggested keeping a notebook of dreams, noting symbols like water, bread, or fire. Even peasants, who could not read or write, remembered dreams orally and passed them on, sometimes seeing them as warnings, sometimes as blessings. The night, it seemed, was alive with meaning, and sleep was only the first act of its drama. Beds themselves reflected this duality. In humble homes, the rush or straw mattresses were rearranged during the waking period, herbs refreshed, and coals from the hearth moved closer or farther depending on the cold. Curtains in wealthier homes were drawn back to let in moonlight or closed again to trap warmth. Blankets were straightened, pillows fluffed, and sometimes small charms were adjusted. Every movement was part of a rhythm of vigilance, a ritual of comfort that allowed the sleeper to return to the second stage of night with peace of mind. Children's sleep carried its own magic. Parents told them short tales, sang quiet songs, or offered a pinch of sweet from the day's stores, honey, dried fruit, or fried fritters before bed. These small acts were both nourishment and reassurance. A child asleep on straw could could feel protected by touch, sound, and scent. Even in the humblest dwelling, bedtime was a moment of ritual, a bridge between work and rest, fear and safety, darkness and dream. The second sleep, longer and more uninterrupted, brought with it dreams that were deeper, sometimes prophetic. People of the Middle Ages placed great significance on these nocturnal visions. A vivid dream of water might foretell rain or flood. Fire could symbolize danger, passion, or transformation. Dreams were studied not only for personal meaning, but for communal guidance. A forewarning dream could be shared at breakfast or during morning prayers. Even kings and nobles consulted advisors about what their night visions might signify. Nightmares were feared intensely. A mare was a pressing spirit believed to sit upon the sleeper's chest, restricting breath and causing anxiety. Remedies were varied, placing iron under the pillow, reciting prayers, or strewing protective herbs. Candles were left burning at strategic points, and charms hung above the bed. Waking from the first sleep offered a chance to reset the body and mind, to chase away lingering spirits, and to prepare for the deeper second sleep. In larger households and castles, night was also the time of discreet activity. Guards patrolled corridors, pages moved quietly to replenish fires, and kitchens tended coals so the morning meal could be ready. The servants' sleep was lighter, punctuated by duty, yet even they were touched by the rituals of scent and warmth. Woolen blankets, small fires, and herbs offered a measure of comfort against the chill and the uncertainty of the night. The medieval understanding of sleep was a delicate balance between practicality, superstition, and psychology. People accepted the cold, the darkness, the insects, and the stray animals as parts of life, while simultaneously creating layers of protection and pleasure, scented herbs, charms, prayers, and ritual. Sleep was not merely absence from waking. It was active, layered, and social. It was a shared human endeavor, stretching from the humblest peasant to the highest lord, from the crowded street to the monastery cell. When dawn approached, the second sleep ended, and the world stirred again. Crowds gathered in markets, animals were fed, and the labor of another day began. But for a few hours each night, the medieval world belonged to dreams and scents, charms, and whispered prayers. It belonged to the warmth beneath the blankets, to the quiet pulse of bodies together, to the watchfulness of the living and the unseen. In those hours, sleep was sacred, practical, protective, and profoundly human. The story of sugar in medieval Europe is a story of movement, of merchants, caravans, ships, and dreams. Unlike bread or cheese, sugar did not grow in European soil. It came from distant lands, carried across deserts, seas, and mountains, transforming the diets, economies, and imaginations of every region it touched. Its arrival turned simple confections into symbols of wealth, ingenuity, and desire. Sugar first appeared in Europe through the Byzantine Empire, but it remained rare and expensive until the Crusades expanded access. By the 12th century, returning knights brought knowledge of sugar from the Levant, along with recipes for spiced syrups, candied fruits, and honey-sugar combinations. These ingredients were exotic, expensive, and transformative. A pinch of sugar could elevate a simple dish into something extraordinary, turning mundane bread into festive celebration, ordinary nuts into delicacies, and ordinary fruits into marvels of preservation. Merchants became the lifeblood of this new economy. Venice, Genoa, and Marseille flourished as hubs for sugar trade. Ships arrived from the eastern Mediterranean loaded with refined sugar, saffron, cinnamon, ginger, and cloves, treasures that moved slowly into northern Europe. Sugar's journey was perilous. Pirates, storms, and fluctuating prices made it a commodity nearly as valuable as gold. But its allure was undeniable. Nobles, wealthy merchants, and ambitious kings were eager to possess it, if only in small, precious amounts. Alongside sugar, spices arrived that transformed both sweet and savory food. Cinnamon from Sri Lanka, cloves from the Moluccas, nutmeg from the Banda Islands, and ginger from India made their way into European kitchens. These spices were expensive, often costing more than the same weight in silver. Yet even small quantities could change the taste of pastries, meats, and sauces. Spices became a status symbol, a sign that a household could afford the very taste of the faraway. Markets and fairs became the stages for this sugary and spiced revolution. Vendors sold candied almonds, sugar-coated fruits, gingerbread, and honey-drenched pastries alongside common bread, cheese, and pies. For the common people, sugar was rare, but its presence in a festival, feast, or wedding was a promise of joy, indulgence, and shared experience. To taste sugar was to taste not just sweetness, but the story of distant lands, dangerous journeys, and human ingenuity. Monasteries played a surprising role in the spread of sugar. Many religious orders grew medicinal herbs, distilled scented waters, and experimented with honey and sugar to create preserves and confections. Their kitchens became laboratories where recipes for marzipan, candied fruits, and sweetened drinks were refined. Monks and nuns often shared these innovations with visiting nobles, spreading both taste and technique across regions. In this way, spiritual devotion and culinary curiosity intertwined, creating some of Europe's earliest documented sweets. The appeal of sugar was both practical and symbolic. Preserving fruit in syrup extended its life, allowing it to travel long distances. Candied nuts and sugar coating prevented spoilage. But beyond preservation, sweetness became an expression of wealth and sophistication. To serve sugar at a feast was to signal refinement, power, and access to distant worlds. It was diplomacy as much as indulgence, a way of showing that one's household was both connected and prosperous. Trade routes determined the flavor map of Europe. Northern regions, colder and less fertile, relied on imported sugar, spices, and dried fruits to supplement local ingredients. Southern regions, closer to Mediterranean ports, had greater access and thus more elaborate recipes. Italy became famous for marzipan and candied citrus. France developed gingerbread and almond pastries. England experimented with sugar, spiced with cinnamon and rosewater. Across these regions, recipes spread, adapted, and transformed, creating both local identity and shared culture. Sugar also altered the rhythm of social life. Banquets and feasts were no longer just about sustenance or ritual. They were performances of taste. Tables were adorned with sugar sculptures, marzipan animals, and decorative confections that delighted the eye as well as the palate. Guests were expected to admire, discuss, and taste, making the act of eating both aesthetic and social. The visual drama of sugar became a language of power, artistry, and celebration. Even ordinary households engaged with sugar when they could afford it. Small amounts were used to sweeten breads, ale, or porridge. Candied fruits appeared at weddings, festivals or religious celebrations. The allure of sugar was universal. Young and old, rich and poor, peasant and merchant alike were drawn to its taste, its novelty, and the sense that sweetness carried a piece of wonder with it. By the late Middle Ages, sugar was no longer merely a luxury for the elite. It was beginning to permeate wider society. Its price remained high, but trade routes stabilized, and recipes were written down, copied, and circulated. Sweetness had become a shared cultural treasure, a commodity that carried both pleasure and prestige. Every candied almond, every marzipan shape, every spiced pastry told a story of travel, commerce, ingenuity, and human desire. Imagine a 15th century market square. The air is thick with smoke from hearths and torches. Merchants shout from stalls, waving sugar sticks, candied oranges, and spiced pastries. Children tug at parents' sleeves, drawn by the scent of honey and cinnamon. Travelers from distant lands pause to admire the sweets, imagining the long journey the sugar took to reach this place. In that moment, every bite becomes a connection between continents, between social classes, and between imagination and reality. Sugar was more than a flavor. It was a symbol. It represented aspiration, ingenuity, and the human drive to reach beyond the local and immediate. It turned ordinary foods into art, labor into delight, and trade into cultural exchange. In the hands of cooks, vendors, and bakers, sugar became the medium through which Europe learned to indulge, to celebrate, and to imagine worlds far beyond their own. Sugar was only the beginning. Once it arrived in Europe, it inspired innovation, experimentation, and artistry. Cooks, bakers, and alchemists alike discovered that sweetness could be molded, preserved, and transformed. Among the earliest and most celebrated creations were marzipan and gingerbread, two confections that combined ingenuity with practicality, delighting the senses while demonstrating mastery over both ingredients and preservation techniques. Marzipan, a delicate mixture of almonds, sugar, and often rose water, became both a sweet treat and a medium for artistic expression. Its origins are debated, with some claiming the Arabs brought the knowledge to Spain and others tracing it to Italian confectioners. Regardless of origin, by the 14th century, marzipan had reached prominence across Europe. Its pliable texture allowed bakers to sculpt fruits, animals, and intricate shapes for feasts, weddings, and religious festivals. Some creations were life-sized, others tiny enough to fit in the palm of a hand. The science behind marzipan was deceptively simple, yet mastering it required precision. Almonds had to be finely ground and carefully mixed with sugar syrup to create a smooth paste. Too much sugar made it brittle, too little, and it crumbled. Flavorings like rose water, orange blossom, or cinnamon were added sparingly, enhancing without overwhelming. Bakers learned that warmth, humidity, and timing determined whether marzipan would hold its shape or collapse. This delicate balance turned confectionery into an art form and demanded both skill and patience. Gingerbread, on the other hand, spoke to a different set of skills and sensibilities. Unlike marzipan, which relied on sweetness and form, gingerbread relied on preservation, spice, and texture. It combined honey or sugar with flour, eggs, and strong spices like ginger, cinnamon, cloves, and sometimes pepper. Its origins were similarly cosmopolitan, blending European and Middle Eastern influences. Initially, gingerbread was baked for festivals, religious celebrations, or market fairs, but over time it became a year-round treat. Preservation was at the heart of these confections. Honey and sugar acted as natural barriers against spoilage, allowing marzipan and gingerbread to survive long journeys and storage. Bakers realized that dense, spiced dough could endure months if kept dry and wrapped properly. This made sweets ideal for merchants transporting them across Europe, for pilgrims carrying gifts to distant monasteries, and for nobles storing treats for months-long feasts. What began as simple sugar slowly became a versatile ingredient that enabled culinary longevity. The appeal of these confections extended beyond taste. Their visual impact transformed them into tools of social and political display. A carefully crafted marzipan centerpiece could impress a visiting noble or dignitary, signaling sophistication, wealth, and cultural literacy. Gingerbread cookies, stamped with patterns or religious symbols, adorned tables during celebrations, reinforcing both faith and festivity. Food in these instances became symbolic, a tangible representation of taste, skill, and power. Markets played a crucial role in spreading these creations. Bakers and confectioners traveled between towns and fairs, sharing recipes, techniques, and samples. Recipes began to be documented in cookbooks, though often guarded closely by guilds. This allowed innovations to spread while maintaining a sense of exclusivity. Wealthy families might commission marzipan sculptures shaped like castles or knights, while commoners purchased smaller treats for weddings, births, and holidays. Each bite connected the eater to a broader European network of trade, culture, and taste. The use of spices in these confections had multiple purposes. Beyond flavor, they acted as preservatives and signals of status. Cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and nutmeg were expensive and rare, imported from Asia through Mediterranean trade routes. A pastry spiced with cinnamon was instantly a luxury item, while one made with local honey or herbs was more modest. This distinction allowed bakers to cater to multiple audiences, the elite seeking extravagance and the commoner seeking affordable delight. Medicinal theories also influenced the production of sweets. Spices were believed to stimulate the body, improve digestion, and balance the humors. Confections were sometimes consumed not only as pleasure, but as remedies. Marzipan was thought to be nourishing, calming, and even restorative for certain ailments. Gingerbread, with its warmth and spice, was sometimes recommended in cold months to aid circulation and prevent illness. In this way, indulgence and utility intertwined seamlessly. The artistry and science of marzipan and gingerbread left lasting cultural traces. European festivals and fairs often featured elaborate sweet displays, with competitions to craft the most beautiful shapes or spiced patterns. Religious holidays incorporated sugar and spice into symbolic gestures, almonds representing purity, gingerbread saints commemorating holy days, and marzipan fruits signaling abundance. These traditions laid the groundwork for modern confectionery, bridging culinary creativity, cultural expression, and social ritual. In small villages, households experimented as well. Mothers baked simple gingerbread with honey and flour, adding local spices when available. Children were fascinated by marzipan animals, often shaping their own from leftover almond paste. These everyday practices nurtured a culture of sweet appreciation that transcended wealth, making sugar both a luxury and a shared delight. By the late Middle Ages, the combined knowledge of preservation, artistry, and flavor had created a robust culture of confections across Europe. Marzipan and gingerbread were more than sweets. They were vehicles of imagination, symbols of social status, instruments of celebration, and tools for preservation. They exemplified how one simple imported ingredient, sugar, could ripple through society, economy, and culture, leaving a lasting impression that survives in countless traditions today. Imagine a 15th century fair, stalls lined with golden honey cakes, marzipan animals glimmering in the sun, gingerbread cut into saints and shields. Children and adults alike marvel at the shapes and flavors, tasting faraway lands in every bite. Each confection is both delight and education, a sweet ambassador bridging continents, cultures, and centuries. In the Middle Ages, sugar was more than an ingredient. It was power, diplomacy, and status condensed into crystalline sweetness. Across Europe, the ability to command sugar, spices, and confections became a visible marker of wealth and influence. Nobles, monarchs, and ambitious merchants used sweet creations not merely to satisfy the palate, but to shape perception, impress visitors, and assert dominance. In this way, culinary taste became inseparable from political theater. Royal courts were the epicenters of the sweet wars. Kings and queens commissioned elaborate displays of marzipan, gingerbread, and sugar sculptures, often depicting mythological scenes, heraldic symbols, or entire castles. These creations were not just art, they were statements. To serve a table adorned with intricate sugar castles or candied animals was to say, we have wealth, reach, and the skill to tame the farthest corners of the known world. Guests were expected to admire these displays, and the act of eating them was a ritual of acknowledgement and participation in power. Diplomacy often traveled on a sugar-laden platter. Monarchs sent gifts of marzipan, gingerbread, or candied fruit to other courts, a practice both ceremonial and practical. Such offerings were messages in edible form, demonstrating access to exotic goods, skilled artisans, and the wealth to spare. A delicately sculpted marzipan peacock could communicate the refinement of a court. A box of spiced almonds could signal goodwill and alliance. Sugar, in this sense, became a tool of international relations, a medium through which politics and pleasure intersected. Guilds and bakers understood this power as well. In cities like Nuremberg, Lübeck, and Paris, confectioners held immense influence. Their skills were essential for fairs, courtly celebrations, and civic ceremonies. Guilds regulated who could produce sugar confections, who could sell them, and under what standards. This control created competition and prestige. Bakers who supplied royalty or created innovative designs gained fame that extended far beyond their city walls. Sweetness became a currency of reputation, as valuable in society as gold or land. Competition for sugar also sparked economic rivalry. The import of sugar and spices required stable trade routes, well-funded caravans, and political protection. Cities with access to ports or proximity to Mediterranean trade hubs had advantages, which they leveraged to dominate regional markets. Rival cities sometimes engaged in subtle sweet wars, attempting to outshine one another in festivals, fairs, and civic events. The display of confections became an extension of municipal pride and rivalry, a visual and edible declaration of economic strength. Even within households, Sugar was a weapon of status. Nobles who could afford imported sugar or exotic spices often served them lavishly, while commoners were restricted to local honey or small amounts of sugar during special occasions. Social hierarchy became codified in taste. A table laden with marzipan and candied fruits signified prestige, while a simple honey cake spoke of modest means. Confections were both a reward for loyalty and a marker of social boundaries, creating desire, admiration, and sometimes resentment. Religious ceremonies also intersected with these sweet politics. Marzipan saints, gingerbread crosses, and sugar-coated offerings were incorporated into festivals, weddings, and holy days. These foods demonstrated piety as well as prosperity. Clergy and nobility alike used sweets to communicate devotion and refinement, blending spiritual symbolism with social signaling. The act of sharing or presenting sugar confections became a gesture that was both sacred and political. The allure of sugar in confections also fueled cultural exchange. Recipes traveled along with traders, pilgrims, and courtiers. Italian marzipan influenced German gingerbread. French almond pastries spread to England. Spices from the East inspired local experimentation. These exchanges created a pan-European culture of sweets, where innovation, taste, and prestige flowed freely, reinforcing both regional identity and continental connection. However, the sweet wars were not without tension. Because sugar was expensive and controlled, it became a target for monopolies, taxation, and regulation. Kings taxed sugar imports heavily, guilds controlled access, and markets enforced standards. Smuggling and black market trade occasionally emerged as merchants sought to bypass restrictions. Sugar was valuable enough to be worth the risk, making it both a commodity and a battleground for wealth and power. Despite these conflicts, sweetness triumphed. Marzipan, gingerbread, and sugar confections became staples of celebration, communication, and artistry. They transformed markets, defined social rituals, and served as instruments of diplomacy and prestige. By the late Middle Ages, the culture of sugar had become fully ingrained, linking trade, art, politics, and pleasure in ways that resonate even today. Imagine a 15th century royal banquet, gilded tables covered with sculpted sugar castles, marzipan animals, and gingerbread shields. Courtiers move carefully, admiring the display, exchanging glances of envy and admiration. Diplomats sample delicacies, understanding that taste is more than pleasure. It is a signal, a message, a statement of influence. Outside the castle walls, markets bustle with vendors selling simpler versions, bringing sugar, spice, and delight to the wider population. Across every social layer, sugar has shaped perception, desire, and human connection. In the end, sugar and confections were never just food. They were instruments of diplomacy, art, and social hierarchy. They shaped celebrations, cemented alliances, and marked prestige. From the merchant's stall to the king's banquet, sweetness carried meaning, power, and ambition, proving that even in the Middle Ages, a simple bite could taste of empire, culture, and human aspiration. When we think of medieval food, we often imagine long, slow meals, roasted meats, hearty stews, and bread baked in stone ovens. But for those who lived in cities, towns, and bustling villages, another culinary world existed, one that was fast, fragrant, and irresistibly greasy, the world of fried snacks and street food. This was the medieval version of junk food, sweet, savory, portable, and designed to satisfy desire before dinner, before ritual, even before thought. Frying was a relatively simple technique, yet it transformed the eating experience. Cooks in England, France, Italy, and the Low Countries discovered that immersing dough, meat, or fish in hot oil or lard created food that was crisp on the outside and tender within. The sound of sizzling fat became an urban anthem, drawing crowds to streets, markets, and fairs. The technique was flexible. Simple doughs could become fritters, dumplings, or pancakes. Small fish could be fried whole. Even vegetables found their way into the bubbling fat. Street vendors became the new architects of appetite. They set up portable braziers, cauldrons of oil, and simple counters in marketplaces. Customers, often laborers, travelers, or children, could grab a quick hot snack between work, prayer, or travel. The portability of fried food made it ideal for urban life. Unlike roasted meats or pies, which required plates and seating, fritters and fried pastries could be eaten with hands, on the go, or while standing by a fountain or market stall. The ingredients of these early junk foods were humble but inventive. Dough was made from coarse wheat, oats, or rye, often enriched with eggs, milk, or honey when available. Fritters could include small pieces of fruit, nuts, or even cheese. Sweet versions were coated with honey or sugar. Savory ones, spiced with pepper, herbs, or salt. In Italy, frittelle and panzerotti delighted fairgoers. In England, pancakes and fritters appeared at markets and festivals. In France, beignets emerged as a street favorite. One of the reasons fried snacks flourished was the combination of accessibility and indulgence. They were cheaper than roasted meats and pastries for the common person, yet richer in fat and flavor than plain bread. The fat provided both energy and satisfaction, a small luxury that could be afforded even by those who worked long hours for little pay. Frying turned the simplest ingredients into pleasure, creating a sense of immediacy and reward that continues in modern street food. Fairs and festivals were especially important for the development of fried snacks. Seasonal events, often linked to religious observances or market weeks, brought together people from surrounding villages. Vendors set up temporary stalls, frying fritters and pastries to meet the demand. These events became culinary laboratories, where cooks experimented with combinations of dough, fillings, and flavorings. Some recipes were simple, others elaborate, designed to impress nobles who might visit the fair. The social dimension of fried food was also significant. Eating in the streets encouraged communal interaction. Strangers shared bites, exchanged coins, and discussed the quality of a vendor's goods. Children ran among adults, mouths sticky with honey or sugar. Frying transformed food into spectacle. The hiss of hot fat, the golden color, the sweet or savory aroma, all contributed to a sensory experience that extended beyond taste. Urban kitchens, too, adopted frying as a fast preparation method. While slow-cooked stews and roasts dominated noble tables, fryer pots were used for quick snacks or morning treats. Bakers experimented with fritters made from leftover dough, turning scraps into quick revenue or sustenance. In monasteries, occasional fried treats were made for celebrations or special occasions, often spiced with honey and herbs. Frying allowed cooks to maximize ingredients while appealing to the growing appetite for novelty and indulgence. Fried snacks were also a form of rebellion against the strictures of medieval food norms. While the church dictated fasting days, prohibiting meat or certain ingredients, fried dough often skirted rules. Fish or vegetable fritters, for example, could be consumed during fasts, providing satisfaction without breaking spiritual law. Vendors and cooks were adept at creating loopholes, labeling items as charity food or emphasizing their ingredients as acceptable for fasting, turning morality into marketing. Even the names of snacks carried intrigue. Fritters, beignets, pancakes, turnovers, crostoli, each reflected regional taste, tradition, and language. Recipes were fluid, often passed orally rather than written. Vendors guarded their methods jealously, creating local variations and secret recipes that became hallmarks of reputation. Customers often returned to specific stalls for the signature taste, creating early forms of brand loyalty. The sensory appeal of fried snacks cannot be overstated. The crackle of hot oil, the golden sheen of a fritter, the smell of honey or fat, the warm sweetness melting on the tongue, all contributed to an experience that was immediate and memorable. Even today, imagining a medieval market with smoke curling from fryer cauldrons and the scent of hot pastries mingling with bread, cheese, and roasted meats conjures a scene alive with color, sound, and flavor. Frying, in essence, created an early form of fast, indulgent, portable food. It met the practical needs of urban life while satisfying desire. It provided energy for labor, pleasure for the senses, and even rebellion against authority. Street snacks, fritters, and fried pastries became a shared cultural phenomenon, linking poor and wealthy, merchant and laborer, pilgrim and townsperson in a common pursuit of taste. The popularity of fried food set the stage for the modern love of snacks, fast food, and treats. Medieval friars, whether in a bustling market or quiet monastery, discovered the power of immediacy, indulgence, and flavor, a combination that resonates centuries later. The Middle Ages, often imagined as austere or simple, had a hidden layer of sizzling indulgence, a culinary undercurrent that made cities alive, children happy, and laborers satisfied. Imagine a narrow medieval street. Smoke rises from a small fryer. The golden fritters hiss in bubbling oil. Children reach for sticky honey, and the scent of spices drifts across stone walls. Laborers pause for a quick bite. Merchants exchange coins, and travelers marvel at the warmth and flavor. In that moment, the streets of Europe are filled with energy, aroma, and delight. Frying is no longer just a technique. It is a social phenomenon, a pleasure, and a form of culture that unites people in shared indulgence. The medieval streets were alive with the clatter of carts, the calls of vendors, and the sense of sizzling, spiced, and sweet foods. While fried snacks dominated many markets, another culinary revolution was quietly underway: the rise of pies, pastries, and portable treats that combined convenience, flavor, and spectacle. These creations were the medieval equivalent of modern fast food, offering nourishment, indulgence, and excitement in one handheld package. Pies were among the most versatile snacks. Initially, they were practical, a simple crust encasing meat, fish, or vegetables, easy to transport and store. Known as coffins or coffins, these pastry shells were often thick and sturdy, designed less for eating than for holding contents securely. They could survive long journeys, making them ideal for travelers, merchants, and soldiers. Yet inside, bakers began to experiment, mixing ingredients with herbs, spices, or sweeteners to delight the taste buds. Sweet pies emerged alongside savory ones. Honey, sugar, and dried fruits were incorporated into crusts and fillings, creating treats for festivals, fairs, and private indulgence. Fruit pies filled with apples, pears, cherries, or quince were common, often enhanced with exotic spices like cinnamon, clove, or nutmeg. Pastry, once a functional vessel, became a canvas for flavor, turning the simple act of eating into both a tactile and sensory experience. Pastries expanded further into regional specialties. In Italy, puffed and fried pastries like zeppel and panzerotti delighted festival goers. In France, flaky tarts and turnovers, often stuffed with almonds, fruits, or cheese, became common sights at fairs and marketplaces. England developed pies stuffed with meat, apples, or sugared fillings, sometimes sealed with dough leaves or intricate patterns. Bakers displayed skill not only in flavor, but in presentation, creating portable art for the streets. Street vendors were key to the spread of these innovations. Unlike noble kitchens, which prioritized elaborate feasts, street bakers needed durability, portability, and immediate appeal. Pastries had to withstand handling, transportation, and time while remaining delicious. The design of dough, the choice of filling, and even the balance of fat and flour were crucial. Skilled bakers learned to create textures that were crisp, tender, and resilient, ensuring that customers could eat on the move without losing pleasure or quality. Markets became laboratories of creativity. Vendors experimented with layering doughs, combining flavors, and incorporating seasonal ingredients. Apples were spiced in autumn, cherries and berries in summer, cheese and honey year-round. Doughs were sometimes flavored with saffron, rosewater, or almond milk, producing unexpected aromas and textures. Customers were drawn not only by necessity, but by curiosity, eager to try new combinations and to judge which baker's skill surpassed the rest. Portability defined these snacks. Pies and pastries could be eaten in hand, on benches, or while walking between stalls. Street snacks allowed laborers and travelers to sustain themselves without the need for utensils or plates, a practicality mirrored by fried fritters. The convenience of handheld indulgence made pies and pastries central to medieval urban life, feeding the energy, appetite, and imagination of city dwellers. Sweetness continued to play a critical role. Honey, the primary sweetener for centuries, preserved fillings and added indulgence. By the late Middle Ages, sugar became increasingly available to urban populations, elevating pies and pastries to new heights of richness. Dried fruits, candied peel, and spices added flavor, aroma, and visual appeal. Eating a pastry became a multi-sensory experience. The aroma of baked dough, the sweetness of honey or sugar, the crunch of crust, and the burst of fruit within. The social dimension of street pastries cannot be understated. These foods were both communal and performative. Children gathered around baker carts, exchanging small coins for treats. Laborers paused at the edges of workshops, discussing flavors and gossip while nibbling pastries. Merchants offered small samples to attract buyers, and travelers marveled at regional specialties. Eating was a shared experience, with food serving as both sustenance and a vehicle for social cohesion. Religious and seasonal festivals further amplified the importance of pastries. During fairs, weddings, and holidays, bakers produced elaborate shapes and forms, crosses for Easter, hearts for weddings, and stars or animals for village celebrations. Pastries became symbolic as well as edible, incorporating faith, culture, and local identity into their form. The festival table, the marketplace stall, and the home kitchen were all stages for creativity, performance, and delight. Economic factors shaped their evolution. Pastries allowed bakers to maximize profits from limited ingredients. Dough scraps became small fritters, offcuts transformed into mini pies, and sweeteners stretched to cover multiple batches. These practices ensured that even humble street vendors could attract customers and turn creativity into livelihood. Pastry making became a skilled craft, requiring not only culinary knowledge, but ingenuity, timing, and understanding of local tastes. The culinary explosion of pies and pastries in medieval streets illustrates a fundamental truth. Desire and convenience are timeless. Bakers responded to social demand, urbanization, and the human craving for novelty and flavor. They transformed ordinary ingredients into portable pleasure, establishing traditions that would influence European food culture for centuries. Imagine a medieval marketplace. The air is fragrant with honey, spices, and baking dough. Children tug at parents' hands, eager for sweet pies. Laborers pause with greasy fingers to taste pastries. Travelers marvel at exotic flavors. Vendors call out their wares, displaying golden crusts, spiced fillings, and delicate shapes. The streets pulse with aroma, sound, and energy, a living testament to the ingenuity and appetite of the age. Frayed fritters and pastries together represent the hidden world of medieval indulgence, a culture of speed, flavor, and spectacle that existed alongside the austere, slow meals often associated with the era. Street snacks provided energy, satisfaction, and social connection, transforming medieval towns into arenas of culinary experimentation and pleasure. Behind every sizzling cauldron, golden fritter, and spiced pastry lay the ingenuity, risk, and tireless labor of the medieval street vendor. These men and women were the unseen architects of a culinary culture that shaped urban life, connected communities, and satisfied the human craving for convenience and indulgence. Their work was far from simple. The streets of medieval towns were crowded, unpredictable, and dangerous, yet vendors thrived, balancing profit, creativity, and reputation with skill and courage. The life of a street vendor began early. Long before the bells of the first chapel rang, bakers and frittersmiths prepared their doughs, batters, and fillings. Fires had to be lit, cauldrons filled with fat, and ingredients measured carefully. Timing was crucial. Overheat the oil, and the fritters burned. Underheat it, and the dough absorbed grease, leaving it soggy and unappealing. Vendors became masters of temperature, texture, and timing, refining techniques, often through trial, error, and observation of customers' reactions. Markets and fairs were both opportunity and hazard. Crowds brought customers, but also thieves, scuffles, and unpredictable demand. Vendors had to maintain vigilance while ensuring speed, quality, and presentation. Many worked in close quarters with competitors, and disputes were common. Reputation was everything. A vendor known for burnt fritters or stale pastries risked losing patrons immediately. Conversely, skill, flair, and consistency could secure loyalty, repeat business, and even regional fame. Frying itself carried danger. Hot oil, heavy cauldrons, and open flames were commonplace in cramped spaces. A slip could scald the cook or ignite surrounding goods. Despite the risk, vendors persisted, learning to manage heat and maneuver around obstacles with practiced ease. Their expertise turned potential hazard into spectacle, drawing attention as sizzling sounds, golden aromas, and visual flair attracted passers-by. Cooking became performance as much as labor. The culture of snack vending extended into social networks and community influence. Experienced vendors trained apprentices who learned the secrets of perfect dough, proper frying, and customer engagement. Families often operated stalls across generations, passing recipes, methods, and reputations down as carefully as property. Vendors became central figures in the marketplace, their skill and reliability linking them to the social and economic heartbeat of the town. Competition among vendors encouraged innovation. Recipes were guarded, and slight variations in spice, sweetness, or texture could distinguish one stall from another. Experimental fillings, sweetened nuts, spiced fruit, cheese, or even small fish kept customers returning, curious to taste new combinations. The drive for novelty created a dynamic culinary ecosystem where taste, presentation, and ingenuity determined survival and prosperity. Fairs and festivals were both boon and challenge. During peak events, demand could surge, overwhelming even experienced vendors. Managing quantity without sacrificing quality required precision, coordination, and endurance. Yet these crowded celebrations also offered the greatest opportunity for profit, reputation building, and word-of-mouth advertising. Successful vendors could rise to prominence, remembered not only for their food, but for their flair, reliability, and ingenuity. Seasonality influenced both risk and reward. Ingredients were often limited by harvest and trade. Sweet fruits, nuts, and sugar were seasonal or expensive, while wheat and fat might be more abundant. Vendors adjusted their offerings accordingly, ensuring their products appealed to customers' tastes while remaining profitable. This adaptability was a hallmark of successful street traders. The cultural impact of these vendors extended beyond mere sustenance. Fried fritters, sweet pastries, and portable pies connected the town socially and economically. They became part of communal rhythm, morning snacks before work, midday sustenance during market hours, treats for children, or indulgences during festivals. Eating was a shared experience, and vendors facilitated it. Their stalls became hubs of socialization, gossip, and entertainment, weaving themselves into the fabric of everyday life. Even regulation shaped their craft. Municipal authorities and guilds often required licensing, restricted sale locations, or set rules for hygiene and weight. Vendors navigated these restrictions while maximizing freedom and profit. Some leveraged creativity to bypass rules subtly, offering specialties only at specific times or locations. Their ingenuity reflected both survival instincts and a sophisticated understanding of urban life. In essence, medieval snack vendors were the unsung pioneers of convenience, indulgence, and culinary culture. They transformed simple ingredients into portable pleasure, entertained and nourished townspeople, and navigated a world of risk, competition, and regulation. Their labor, skill, and creativity created a hidden culture that shaped social interaction, taste, and urban life, a culture whose influence persists in the modern love of street food and quick indulgence. Picture a bustling medieval street. A vendor's cauldron hisses, golden fritters bob and crisp in bubbling fat. Children clutch pastries, adults pause to sample spiced pies, and the aroma draws in curious travelers. Coins change hands, stories are exchanged, and vendors skillfully balance heat, speed, and presentation. Every fry, fold, and sprinkle represents a delicate dance of labor, skill, and human desire, turning the streets into a living celebration of food, energy, and ingenuity. Through risk, reputation, and relentless innovation, these vendors not only sustained themselves, but also nourished a culture of indulgence, creativity, and social cohesion. Their legacy is enduring: the sizzling sound of a fryer, the golden crust of a pastry, the sweet aroma of honey or spice. These are echoes of a medieval tradition that shaped both taste and society.